Mother Earth Medicine,
an ancestral intelligence podcast to heal our future. Welcome to Mother Earth Medicine podcast. I am your host, Lyla June. My co-host, Amy Robertson, is off for the month, but she'll be back next month. And I'm so happy to be sitting here today with Dr. Nelly Masayi from the western part of Kenya. She is from the Luhya Indigenous Nation, spelled Luhya, native nation of Western Kenya. She is a lecturer and a PhD in geography at Kibabi University. Her research areas mainly focus on mitigation of climate change and biodiversity loss. She also looks into ecosystem services and community livelihoods. And I met her at the World Biodiversity Forum conference in Davos, Switzerland, which is sort of a counter conference to the World Economic Forum, as I stumbled into a room where she and her colleagues were discussing really important matters of building capacity in Africa within communities to support biodiversity, as well as honoring the indigenous knowledge that lives throughout Africa in its ability to support biodiversity. So happy to have you here, Nelly. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Leila. Thank you.
Yes. So let's start with our first question. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your cultural background or your geographical background before we get started on some questions?
Definitely, yes. I was born in western parts of Kenya, as you mentioned, specifically a county called Kakamega County, a sub-county called Kakamega North-South County, Chimuche Ward, and specifically from a village called Shitirira Village. I went to school in Shitirira Primary School and another primary school called Isanjiro Primary School. So my background was basically being raised in this particular village that is adjacent to Malaba Forest, which is a fragment of Kakamega Forest. And Kakamega Forest is believed to be a fragment of the Congo Forest. My high school, I went to a school called Bunyore Girls High School, a national school in western parts of Kenya. I did my bachelor's degree in education, mathematics and geography from Maseno University. I also did a master's degree in geography from Maseno University. My PhD was also done in Kenya, a PhD in geography from a university called Moi University. I was privileged to have a postdoc at the University of Nairobi, where specifically I was focusing on the role of nature-based solution in mitigating climate change and biodiversity loss within the African savannas. So basically that is my background, a village girl from Shitirira village. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And so what are your personal passions in the work that you do in Kenya? What makes you most excited and what kind of work are you most passionate about?
Many people call me Teacher Nelly because of my passion as an educator. I really desire to pass knowledge, specifically the knowledge that the older people had, and it worked for them to pass that particular knowledge to the younger generation so that they can also learn things that can easily work. Specifically, I'm keen on conservation of biodiversity. I'm keen on mitigating climate change, and I'm keen ensuring that the local community, particularly the women, are able to meet the needs of their loved ones, especially the children that they are raising in these particular societies.
And so you say that you really like the older people's knowledge, the elders of the Luhya Nation, Indigenous Nation. What's just one of your favorite things that the elders tell you and tell the youth? What's an example of the knowledge that you pass on to the next generation?
The Luhya community are deep into the traditional culture or traditional knowledge, and some of those particular knowledges have really, really worked. And what I really appreciate is how they have conserved biodiversity using indigenous knowledge. Now, if I will mention a few of the things that the Luhya community do to ensure that we do not lose on important crop species, they are keen on preservation of critical maize species, and they do not use insecticides, but instead what they do after harvesting the maize, specifically like the maize that we call nabanane, or the maize that is yellow maize in our local language, we call them matumakesh pindi. Specifically, we keep this particular maize in the kitchen, close to where we have fire, and the smoke that comes from the fire dries this particular maize for a whole year, so that we are able to keep these particular maize and use them as seeds the following year. And by doing this, basically, we still have this particular maize. We do not destroy species by using pesticides, especially the crops. The Luhya community embraces the use of ash just to do away with some of the pests that destroy crops. We embrace mixed cropping, and by mixed cropping in itself, some pests, some diseases are normally taken care of. That is in terms of crops. Now, in terms of animals, we have quite a number of animals that we would call totemic species that, according to the Luhya community, we are not allowed to destroy them. Like, for instance, a tree like the Aloe africana, our culture prohibits us from destroying that particular tree because of the cultural attachment to this particular tree. And therefore, by doing that, these particular species are not normally destroyed. We also have some trees such as Erythrina abyssinica, that is its scientific name. According to the Luhya community, this tree is normally very significant in curing mumps. So when somebody has mumps, you carry a little firewood, you go and sing along that particular tree, singing a song in Luhya. This is how we sing it. And as we sing that particular song, the mumps, in a unique way, the mumps normally disappear. And because of its medicinal value, the Luhya culture does not allow anybody to cut that particular tree and specifically use it for firewood. And by doing that, we actually are preserving this particular tree species. We also have sacred groves and shrines. Like in the Luhya culture, we call them Huluya, like within the Kakamega forest. And we are not allowed to cut trees within Huluya or within that particular shrines and the grooves. And by doing this, these particular species are preserved. Luhya community, we embrace, unfortunately there's some noise on the background, but we embrace carrying out some afforestation, especially during burial. We plant some trees, like the Africana that I mentioned. And by planting this particular tree, then these particular species are conserved. We have meats, all that. Like we, in our culture, like especially the clan where I come from, we have myths that we belong to the elephant generation, and therefore we are not allowed to kill the elephants. And by doing this, these particular species are conserved. So we have so many, I've just mentioned a few.
I know, I bet you could go on. And it's so nuanced and beautiful the way that you guys protect certain species through your culture and through your spirituality. And that's very common around the world. For all indigenous nations, we have very specific cultural beliefs. I wrote a paper one time about the Matsagenka nation, and they have a belief that after a man has a child, he cannot hunt for 2 years. And so that actually preserves some of the monkey species in the area. And they also believe that whatever kind of monkey that you eat, you also eat its qualities. So there's a very slow monkey. I think it's called the howler monkey. And they don't eat that one because that's a very slow monkey and they don't want to be slow people. So that monkey gets conserved. And they also have a belief that you have to be gentle in the forest and you can't be too loud in the forest or you go disturb the spirits. And so they don't use shotguns for hunting. They only use more quieter weapons like arrows because the shotguns are too loud. And so that also decreases the amount of monkeys that they can hunt at a time. And so all these different cultural beliefs are not just silly little stories or silly little folklore. They have real purpose in our lives as Indigenous peoples to help us be careful how much we take from the land. And I imagine that when a man cannot hunt after the first two years of having a child, he relies on his community to help him. And he's there for his wife more, maybe, I don't know. And maybe he focuses more on crops, like other types of foods that he can bring. And so the community probably helps that child, and his brothers will help him, so it also builds community instead of thinking he has to do it all alone, perhaps. But in any case, that's very beautiful. How many Indigenous nations are there in Kenya?
We have about 42. Some are major, some are minor. Major ones like the Luhya, the Akikuyu, but some are minor like the Okieks. Those are minor.
And so with the word indigenous, is that something you guys use in Kenya to describe yourselves, or is that kind of a new term?
Okay, many a times we use the word indigenous or cultural groups. Yes, or tribes. We use the word tribes.
Right. Would you say that everybody from Kenya at one point was from a tribe, right?
Yes, he's from a tribe, an indigenous tribe. Maybe apart from a few who were born out of mixed marriages from probably people of a different culture. But still, in the Kenyan culture, we associate children with their father. So they will still be associated with the indigenous group of their father.
And so there are some Kenyans who do not identify as tribal or indigenous or cultural. Is that because they've mostly assimilated into the more colonial culture?
Yes, some of them are crossbreed between local community and other tribes, but still there is something coming up in Kenya among the young people. They call themselves Gen Z. So for them, they say they do not have a tribe. They only have one tribe, and their tribe is called Unity. So most of them do not even know how to speak the local language because they use English and Swahili because of the colonization and going to school. So now this generation of people do not know much about those particular cultural activities because most of them were brought up in urban centers. So they have tended to forget about all these particular cultural beliefs. And they normally say, we do not have a tribe. For us, we are just Gen Zs, and we just believe in unity. We don't believe in many other things like affiliation to any other tribe.
Right. And it's beautiful to be unified, but you can't lose your culture in the process. Just like a rainbow has so many colors, even though it's unified into one rainbow, you can still have many colors and many languages and still be unified.
I totally agree with you that by us going to say we have one tribe, we do not really put a lot of emphasis on our tribal alienation. We are missing on critical things that used to make sense. So we can still talk about unity in our country. We can still push for similar agendas without necessarily losing on our values, our cultural beliefs, especially those beliefs that used to bring positive impact in our nation and the globe at large.
Right. And so moving on to our next question, I was just curious about those because, in the United States, we have many indigenous groups, and the word indigenous is kind of a new word for us too, but we like it better than they called us Indians, they called us Native Americans, and we didn't really like either of those words. And indigenous means you're of the land, you are born of the land, and we kind of like that term these days, indigenous nations. So I was just curious, a lot of African people might not identify as indigenous, maybe because it's obvious that every African, Black African is indigenous to Africa, obviously. Do you guys have a name for Africa besides Africa, like a word that is more indigenous to your language?
No, we do not have another name. We just call ourselves Africa. But now the biggest problem that most people shy away from, especially the young people, from being associated as indigenous, is because some young people will feel like indigenous means being unexposed. We are not exposed. I think that. So they wouldn't want to be associated with a group, a name that signifies that they are not so much exposed, they are not so much enlightened, they are not so much learned. So many times those words could be associated to some group of people or some clans that, like the Ogieks, the Dorobos, that were raised in the forest with fewer schools. So basically, I would say marginalized. So most young people will not appreciate that. And to me, that is a very important term that I would be gladly wish to be associated with the indigenous Luhya community.
Yes, everything you explained about how your community protects life and protects species is something that we should be proud of. And the same thing happened here in the United States, which we call Turtle Island. We don't call it the United States. We call it Turtle Island. This big North American continent is what we call it. But the same thing happened where a long time ago, my nation, the Diné nation, Diné people who were traditional, who lived on the land, would be humiliated by those who had cars, those who ate certain kinds of European foods, those who dressed in European clothing. They would be humiliated for living a traditional lifestyle, for not speaking English. And that's such a tragedy because the ones who should be humiliated are the ones who are destroying the earth. The ones who should be humiliated are the ones who are engaging in colonial behavior and colonization of conquest of lands. Not that anyone should be humiliated. I don't think anyone should be humiliated, but the ones who should be maybe embarrassed, I guess, are the ones who are not living close to the earth and not taking care of her with love and reciprocity. And so I know exactly what you mean. In fact, the very reason I cannot speak my indigenous language is because my grandmother didn't want us to know our indigenous language, and she hid it from us. And she wanted us to only speak English because she was embarrassed of our language. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And I hope and I pray that the youth of the indigenous communities of Kenya really reclaim their identity as indigenous peoples and be proud of it and share it with the world and stand tall and stand firm in their roots as indigenous communities.
That's very true. Very, very true.
You're listening to Mother Earth Medicine,
an ancestral intelligence podcast to heal our future.
This podcast is brought to you by Cultural Survival. We are an Indigenous-led organization that has been supporting Indigenous peoples in their self-determination, defense of their rights and territories, and continuance and revitalization of their lifeways, cultures, and languages for more than 50 years.
We invite you to visit our website, www.cs.org, and make a donation. Every donation counts, no matter the size. Your donation will go a long way to ensure that Indigenous voices across the planet are heard and actions are taken to protect their rights and territories, along with the future of Mother Earth.
Thank you for contributing to our work with Indigenous peoples around the globe. It's an investment in a flourishing future for all.
So, you mentioned a few things about how the Luhya protect biodiversity and endangered species. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the importance of Indigenous knowledge and cultural knowledge and local knowledge in Kenya in protecting biodiversity and endangered species?
Of course, I can't lack something, especially in terms of protecting biodiversity. Like Kenya government is pushing for growing of so many trees, which is a very good initiative. Now, let me show you how the Luhya people would do this. In the olden days, whenever somebody will debark a tree so that they get some some herbal medicine, the Luhya community embraced the use of applying mud on that particular place that has been debarked to ensure that this particular tree does not dry. Now, similarly, like the Luhya women were only allowed to cut, especially some medicinal plants, you are only allowed to cut branches, but a Luhya woman is not allowed to cut the tree down. Or when you are going for herbal medicine, you are only allowed to pull out one tree. And of course, this herbal medicine could be given by medicine men. If we would embrace this, probably the government of Kenya will not be struggling to plant so many trees. We will just plant those that are necessary or those that are significant, especially the indigenous ones, as we embrace this particular culture that used to work in the olden times. I'm excited about what the government of Kenya nowadays is doing, embracing nature-based solutions to ensure that biodiversity is conserved and climate change is mitigated. And one thing about nature-based solution is it embraces the role of indigenous communities as stakeholders. So that is something that I would really wish to continue so that the indigenous communities are put on the table, especially when anybody is discussing issues to do with climate change and biodiversity conservation. Particularly in Luhya community, we have a clan called the Abanyore. The Abanyore community, they do very well in terms of predicting of weather. They are weather people, so they can predict weather. So if they are put on the table when we are talking about climate change, this particular group of people would do positive things or would add value because they have the ability to stop rain, especially whenever we have like a burial ceremony, and they would give us some knowledge that can really, really help us in terms of climate change and biodiversity conservation. Now, the indigenous people have a lot of knowledge in terms of monitoring trends in droughts, monitoring trends in rainfall patterns, especially by just observing at the birds, observing the procedure, the movement of the butterflies. So these people really need to be put on the table whenever we are talking about climate change and biodiversity conservation. I believe they have critical knowledge that can help the government of Kenya in terms of addressing climate change and biodiversity loss in this particular country.
Yes, I think that all of your clans sound kind of like magical. Like they can control the weather and listen to birds and butterflies. But it's true. I think obviously when you stay in one place for thousands and thousands of years, you become so intertwined with the details of that place, obviously. And so I love what you're saying. Have you had any success bringing indigenous groups to the table? Have you had any success collaborating with the Kenyan government as Native nations and indigenous tribes in Kenya?
I would say yes, but I wouldn't say much about my community. I would give an example of the Turkana community where I have done some research in that particular community. And yes, the government of Kenya, the county government, and the local community are carrying out various activities to ensure that climate change is mitigated. Like, for instance, whenever they want to do a forestation program, the local community is put into place and tasked to give ideas on which plants they would wish to be used for afforestation. And many times they give ideas of the indigenous trees where those particular trees can be used as herbal medicine, as fruits. They are maybe food for their animals, and at the same time, they are utilized in afforestation. And I think the local community the indigenous community being involved is very, very critical, because just bringing a foreigner to do that in a community without involving them, there would be a possibility of probably introducing exotic trees or trees that are not significant to the local community. But with the local community being put in place, a lot of afforestation is being done in the region with the blessing of the local community, and therefore the local community are playing a critical role in like watering the trees, supporting the whole initiative, just ensuring that it is successful. Still, the same thing is also being done around Kakamega Forest. The local community are being engaged to ensure that they play a role in afforestation program, planting the tree seedlings in the region, and in doing this, they are feeling like a part of the whole initiative, and therefore protecting this particular forest with a lot of zeal.
That is so cool. And it's so smart, I think, to engage the local nations. And I remember hearing about Wangari Maathai, who I think is no longer in flesh anymore, but she started the Green Belt movement in Kenya, planting millions of trees. And she won the Nobel Peace Prize for this, for mobilizing the women of Kenya to plant trees. Do you know if she was from a indigenous community?
Yes, Wangari Maathai was from the indigenous community called the Agikuyu indigenous community. And this is one woman who really fought, especially the protection of Karura Forest. She played a role in deterring the government from deforesting that particular community. And at first, the government at that particular time fought her so much. They arrested her. They made her life miserable. But with the time, everybody can be able to see that what this woman was pushing for was very, very important. And she played a critical role in ensuring that deforestation is minimized in Kenya. So she's Agikuyu community. And during her burial, I had an opportunity to have a look at her home. She had done a lot of afforestation in her own home. So she was not just talking about afforestation, but she was doing it.
How do you spell her tribe or her indigenous nation?
Agikuyu, Agikuyu community.
Wow. I had no idea that she was from an indigenous community, but it makes sense that a woman from the cultural communities, the traditional knowledge of Kenya, from the roots of her ancestors, would be the one to lead the project, not only to reforest Kenya, but to mobilize the women. In the Luhya nation, your nation, are women given a special role in society, or is it kind of similar to colonial culture where we're having to kind of fight for our place in the world?
In the Luhya community, we are still struggling with a few things, because the land is owned by men. The land is owned by men, though the Kenyan constitution now allows women to own land. However, it is in the constitution, but on the ground, things are a bit different, because the government of Kenya can say, yes, you can own land. But now when the real thing, now you are at home and you're asking your father to give you land, they do not. They are not in a position to give you land. And probably as a child, as a girl child, the battles you may need to fight to get that particular piece of land is not so easy. So that is a problem. Most of the women that have owned land are widows. The widows have land because now they have taken land from their husbands. And many a times when their sons grow up, now they become the sole owner of this particular land. Now, what I normally push for in my community is, if I want to succeed in this afforestation initiative, many a times I engage the widows. When I engage the widows and we are talking about afforestation using fruit trees, it's normally very easy because many of them are now owning land and they easily show you this. They would easily say, this is the piece of land that I have, it is mine. And because it is mine, I would love to do ABCD, and you're able to provide them with seedlings. They now easily embrace that particular initiative. But when it comes to the land owned by men, it takes time, because now we normally have to engage with the men now. And after engaging with the men, now the men have now the right to give their wives a go ahead to engage in this particular project. Like I have engaged in a project called the Dryland FRN project that embraces afforestation among the Pokot indigenous community of Kenya. So for this one, we engage the women a lot, but for us to succeed, we had to also engage the men because the land is majorly owned by the men. And now, once we engage the men embrace the idea. Now they can allow the afforestation programs to take place, and the women now play a role of watering the trees, providing food to the people who are carrying out environmental conservation in the region. And now that particular project is a success.
Do you think that the male ownership of land in Luhya culture, has it always been that way, or is it the result of colonial culture infiltrating our indigenous communities? Because, for example, my nation, the Diné nation, which is also incorrectly known as the Navajo nation. The world calls us Navajo, but we call ourselves Diné. You know, we didn't always have men leading our government. But ever since the creation of the colonial Navajo Nation government in the 1950s, every single president of the Navajo Nation has been a man. But that's not how it used to be. Before this government was created in the 1950s, and I call it a puppet government because it was created by the colonizer. The colonizer created our government because it needed a hand to shake or an entity that could sign away coal, gas, uranium, and they needed some kind of entity that they could do business with. And so they created the Navajo Nation for us in a way. But before that, we had no centralized government. We had decentralized clans all across the land, hundreds of clans, and these clans were led by women. And these clans were led by women who were very respected. And the men had a huge role still, because it takes the masculine and the feminine to bring life and to protect life. But these women were very, very respected, and we still are today. It's just in the government that we're not really respected so much because the government is more colonial. So do you think there was a time in the past before colonization or before some time when Luhya women were more empowered?
I would say yes. Because in the olden days, the land was communally owned. Now, when the colonial master came in, he now brought in the issue of title deeds. Now, with the introduction of title deeds, now there was scramble for land. Everybody wants to own land. And the men now had the ability to own land. And the women now became the dependents. But in the olden days, the land was communally owned. And women used to play a critical role in planting of the indigenous crops, like the bambara groundnuts, the groundnuts themselves, the soya beans, the sim, sesame, we call them sesame, just among many. And they had a mechanism of ensuring that these particular crops grow without being distracted. Like they would even plant bananas on huge pieces of land. And some, like among the Luhya community, some of the strategies that they ensured that they would do to ensure that there is no overharvesting of bananas, they are some of the norms or the rules. Like once you are married, you were not allowed to come back to your mother's home and cut a banana. It was illegal. They said it was like a curse to do that. So that pushed women when they are married to ensure that they are planting their own bananas in their own farm, or when they come home to their mother's place, it is their brothers who are giving them this banana. And when somebody else is giving you a banana, he may not necessarily give you the right size. So it gave it that those particular cultures had empowered the women to do a lot of farming, and there was a lot of production. But of course, with the introduction of the colonial master and title deeds, and another thing, again, the colonial master came in with the issue of agricultural production through monoculture. Like in my country now, there was the issue of planting, or introduced us to monoculture, like planting of sugarcane farms. So with the introduction of sugarcane farming on monoculture, now the indigenous crops lacked their place, because there's now a very little piece of land left for the indigenous crops. Now, this in itself brought food insecurity, because now after harvesting this particular sugarcane, it is the man who does the planting of the sugarcane because he's the one who is owning the land. So the man is getting empowered, but probably he does not have the ability to effectively provide for the family the way a woman has. Yet he's the one who is holding a huge amount of money. So I totally agree with you with the exposure to the modern, what we would call in quotes, modern lifestyle, foreign or European ways of earning livelihoods like monoculture, title deeds that interfered with the ability of a woman to take care of herself and her children.
Right, right. That makes sense. Thank you for sharing that. So we'll just have a couple more questions. And I think a lot of our listeners are from North America, from Europe. And so it's very cool, I think, that, you are here sharing your story with the world. And we also hope that more listeners from Africa will start to listen to our podcast, Mother Earth Medicine, so that which used to be Tsétsêhéstâhese podcast, but Tsétsêhéstâhese joined forces with Cultural Survival to create Mother Earth Medicine podcast. But we would love to continue to weave our kinship and our connection with African indigenous communities so that we can bear witness to each other's struggles and be there for each other and be a community together, a global indigenous community, and all of our allies and friends who believe in us to be woven stronger. So it's very cool that your story is getting out to so many countries. I think we have 82 countries that listen to our podcast. Okay, next question. Is there a general respect for indigenous nations in Kenya as of now on behalf of the more mainstream culture? I think you answered this a little bit already when you said that the youth are feeling embarrassed to be who they are, but is there a general respect for indigenous culture in Kenya?
I would say partly yes. And why I would say yes is because of the Constitution of Kenya. The Constitution of Kenya 2010 actually protects the indigenous and marginalized community. And this is done through the Bill of Rights, the provisions in the Bill of Rights, whereby they recognize cultural heritage, land rights, and rights of indigenous people being represented in various forums. So through that, many of the indigenous community have now had an opportunity to speak up their mind, to air their views, and to push for the various agendas that they have. Like previously, we had problems whereby the indigenous people would just be resettled from the forest, their ancestral forested lands. They would just be pushed out, probably because they want to put there a national park that could be utilized for tourism or maybe to protect that particular forest. But right now the indigenous people's voice are being heard. They now have a cultural rights, and they are even the sharing of benefits, the ecosystem, the benefits that are acquired from ecosystem services like tourism, just to mention a few. However, we have a few gaps still there. We still have some communities that are still being evicted from their ancestral lands, and we still have some scenarios whereby some things are being done without necessarily the consent of the indigenous community. But we would say it is a journey. So the Kenyan government is on a journey. We have not arrived, but we are on our journey headed towards supporting the indigenous community.
Right. In the United States, for a long time, it was not Native people, indigenous people were seen as not even human. We were seen as like pests, and they were trying to exterminate us. And so what we had to do is we had to slowly continue to stand in our dignity and to show them that who is the real savage here? Is it us, or is it colonial culture that is savage and brutal and merciless sometimes, with the way that it killed 98% of our people? It almost destroyed all of us. And so today, though, in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a very important movement to start to recognize not only the rights of Indigenous people, but the beauty of Indigenous people. And now, today, it's very cool to be Native. It's very cool to be Indigenous in the United States, but it wasn't always like this. And slowly we are being invited literally to the table. I was just sitting at a table with the California government land use office, and they were asking me to help them with their state guidelines. So it's very exciting time, and President Biden required that every federal agency integrate traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples when he was in office before Trump. But he, so there's a lot of movement, but there's also a lot of challenges. We still face a lot of ignorance on behalf of American culture, a lot of invisibility, a lot of stereotyping. And so that's why I started my school, Rehuman School, to teach people about Indigenous culture in the United States and beyond. So I'm glad that you guys are also on your journey. I just have one more question for you. Let me pull it up here. What are the goals and the dreams and aspirations of Indigenous nations in Kenya today, would you say?
I would love, as an Indigenous person, or we would love to be allowed to inhabit the land that our forefathers inhabited. We wouldn't want to be chased away from our native land because of other things, like maybe because of construction of national parks, because of protection. Our belief is if our forefathers lived with the wild animals amicably in the olden days, we do not have any agenda to destroy the wild animals. We will just want to live with the wild animals amicably, the way our forefathers lived with. We would want to live with our trees, with our plants, with everything in peace. So we want to inhabit the land that our forefathers inhabited, and we do not want to be evicted from our land. Secondly, as Indigenous people, we want our knowledge to be incorporated to the contemporary knowledge that is now working right now. And we believe that if our Indigenous knowledge is put together with the contemporary knowledge, we will have better results and a better world tomorrow.
Wow. So what is one of the national parks in Kenya where the Luhya people were evicted?
Okay, the Mount Elgon National Park is actually on the border of the Luhya and the Sabawot people. So most of the people were pushed away. That is our national park. Most of the people were pushed away to ensure that to create a Mount Elgon National Park, and of course the reserve, the Mount Elgon National Reserve. And another thing that I would want to mention about the Mount Elgon, that is that even with various mechanisms being put in place to restore that particular forest ecosystem, some of the mechanisms that are put in place are not favorable to the local community, part of them who are the Sabawot and part of them who are the Luhyas living in this particular region. Like, for instance, there is the introduction of the Shamba system, whereby a piece of land is put in place and the local community are allowed to cultivate their crops and plant some trees as a mechanism to tame the trees, as they also take care of the crops. And the moment they harvest the crops, the trees are allowed to continue growing, and in the process, the forest is rehabilitated. Unfortunately now, in the whole process, some people who are not locals are also allowed to get some land in that particular region. And some of the people who get this particular land, them not being local, they have no passion of protecting this particular forest. And according to the local community, and I personally did a research in this particular region, they are the people who are not local, yet getting land in that particular region, are the ones who are doing more harm to the forest as compared to the local community. So you are giving land to to the local community as well as to foreigners. So the foreigners continue doing harm to the land because they totally have no attachment to this particular forest ecosystem. Yes, just to mention one of them.
And even if they did have a passion and a desire to protect the land, they wouldn't have the knowledge or the ability to do so. And so it makes sense. And when I was talking about the Tsétsêhéstâhese nation of Peru and how we were researching their cultural beliefs and how their cultural beliefs protect the biodiversity of the monkey populations. This same group, the Tsétsêhéstâhese indigenous nation, they were being kicked out of an area to create Manu National Park. And so this happens all over the world where indigenous groups are being asked to leave their homelands for the creation of national parks that are usually conceived and operated by white Europeans who think that they know how to conserve land better than a people who have lived there for tens of thousands of years. And so I know exactly what you're talking about. How do you spell Mount Egon? Is it E-G-O-N or A-G-O-N?
It is E for egg, L-G-O-N. There's a lot of resettlement of people, not only the Luyas, even the Ogieks, the Sabawot community, they were resettled from that particular region. And some of the reasons that were being given by the government was that it is very, very cold. We want to settle you in a more warmer place. But in real sense, our great ancestors lived in that particular place without having a problem.
Of course. And it's your home. So you can never be divorced from your home. I learned, or you stop becoming who you are, because if your identity is so connected to a sacred mountain and you're forced to leave your mountain, a lot of who you are, you cannot be any longer. The sacred sites, the ceremonial sites, the ceremonies that go on in these sites, all of a sudden, all of those cultural practices are left behind as well, because our cultural practices are woven into the land and they need the land to occur sometimes. Not all of our cultural practices, but a lot of them are place-based, meaning they cannot occur anywhere else except that mountain. And so that was my undergraduate paper, actually. I called it ethnic endemism. You know, we think of endemic species like the blue-cheeked butterfly fish, which is only found in the Red Sea in the entire world. But if you destroy that sea, you destroy that fish. And so endemic species are very vulnerable to extinction. Same is true for indigenous cultures. They are endemic. They can only be found in one place and they need to exist in one place. And if you take that place away from them, those cultures can go extinct. And so I just really appreciate what you're doing. And I pray with you that your people, your community can return to your ancestral homelands. And I believe it will happen. I believe slowly the world is waking up to the importance of bringing justice to indigenous nations who have been wronged in the past by people who honestly don't even know what they're doing and never really did. And in the United States, we have a movement called the Land Back Movement. And people are returning land to indigenous nations, left and right, everywhere. These lands are being returned. And so I pray the same happens in Kenya soon. And is there any final thoughts you'd like to share? I know you're a mother of 3 kids. It's getting late in Kenya. I know you probably have to go. So is there anything else you'd like to share before we sign off?
Yes, maybe to say thank you for giving me an opportunity to discuss this. I am a mother and I have a desire that my children do not throw away important indigenous knowledge that worked for my forefathers. Anything that worked, anything that is good, need to be transferred to the next generation. So I would desire that it becomes not only my desire, but the desire of our listeners and anybody who cares about the tomorrow, the children that we are having tomorrow, or who cares about the future, that we all embrace the move to ensure to going back to what used to work and let it work for us today and work for us tomorrow. Thank you very much, Leila. Nice. It was nice seeing you in Davos and just getting to know you and what you do.
It was an honor to meet you in Switzerland at the Biodiversity Forum. And I just want to say, lastly, that you are such a powerful, beautiful Indigenous woman who is a role model to me and so many people. Dr. Nelly Masayi, who here is of Indigenous community of Kenya, and who is a woman and still fought through all of the limitations we try to put on people to become a lecturer, a PhD, and a leader of her people. And so in my culture and Diné culture, we honor women. And so I honor you greatly for who you are and what you stand for. And thank you so much. And thanks to all of our listeners for taking the time to listen about Nelly and the Luhya Nation. Mother Earth Medicine is a podcast brought to you by Cultural Survival. Stream us on your favorite podcast platform and follow us on Instagram and Facebook under Cultural Survival, and also on Instagram under Mother Earth Medicine Podcast.
We would like to thank the Cornell Ornithology Lab for allowing us to use recordings of the yellow-bellied sapsucker from their collection. This bird is known to the Chata people as Biskinik, the little Choctaw newsbird.
If you like our content, please share it with others. It's very important that the wisdom of Indigenous nations reaches as many communities as possible. And please consider joining us in solidarity by making a donation to Cultural Survival at cs.org/donate.